16th century came the mass importation of African slaves to the Americas during the Columbian Exchange. Seen as an import, these slaves were used for physical labor, such as picking cotton, harvesting sugarcane, and other mainly agricultural work. Within years, slaves were stripped of their basic human rights, being beaten or flogged for standing out of line. To the slave owner, slavery was the will of God, proven by the clergy to be a proper practice. Although the pressure and pain on slaves by slave owners was brutal and inhumane, ultimately these unbearable pressures are what led to the beginning of the abolitionist movement and the advocacy for African American slaves. Seen as a religious cause, the abolitionist movement was brought up by the points of the Second Great Awakening. This Protestant awakening pushed humanity against slavery to see the practice as a sin and encouraged the idea that all people are seen equal in the eyes of God. This religious connection brought forth the action of many speakers against slavery, such as Frederick Douglass, whose writings spoke out against all inequality and against the practice of slavery. The women of the abolitionist movement also had a great voice, as they were a key role in shifting America to anti slavery. Harriet Tubman allowed the movement to assist existing slaves through her influence in the Underground Railroad. The abolitionist movement was universal, including white abolitionist thinkers such as William Lloyd Garrison, who saw it as a moral obligation to fight slavery through his writings and his establishment of the Anti Slavery Society. The Anti Slavery Society sought to end slavery under the idea that it went against the precedents of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. These people and their influence attempted to mute the presence of racism and hate in America, which would go on to cause massive change in the lives of many African Americans. Another influence for the movement was a shift from an agrarian society to an industrial one, meaning people in the North saw slavery as a stint to the ever growing industrial business practices of the future. In the timeline of the abolitionist movement, there were many key moments where the goals of the movement were made stronger. In 1808, the abolition of slave trade to the Americas became the first event which showed change in the treatment of slaves. However, not all events had beneficial outcomes. The nullification crisis showed slave states fighting for states' rights on slavery. While the outcome was muted by the current president, Andrew Jackson, it became a foreshadowing for what was to come during the fight between free and slave states. Another important event which changed the outcome of the movement was the Dred Scott decision. This court case showed Dred Scott, a slave, fighting for his rights against his owner, but the ruling of the case said that African Americans had no right to be citizens, and their power in America would always be muted. It proved to the emancipators how important it was to achieve rights for slaves, because otherwise they would have always been seen as property. Abolitionist literature played a key role in creating a voice during the movement. Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, effectively humanized the suffering of enslaved African Americans and contributed to the abolitionist groups in the North. Her work showed the effect of a literary voice of events in America, as it began to stir controversy over whether enslavement was justified. Another important literary work was The Liberator, overseen by William Lloyd Garrison. This newspaper helped organize the movement by informing citizens about the reality of the abolitionist movement. As a result of the anti slavery movement, the abolition of slavery was eventually brought about. Unfortunately, this could not happen until the split between the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War. The Civil War would eventually end after much bloodshed, and the dispute over slavery was over after Lincoln's address of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Once this occurred, the Union's victory meant so much more, eventually leading to the emancipation of over 4 million slaves in the United States. Eventually, with the 15th Amendment, the law for black voting was passed, giving full suffrage to African American citizens. Influenced by the achievements of the abolitionist movement, the Republican Party was created in 1853. This platform for the Republican Party assisted in pushing the abolition of slavery. With the platform of freed slaves, influence to fight for segregation was made. as activists such as Martin Luther King would eventually take black rights a step further by vying for complete equality between white and black citizens. The abolition of slavery in the South changed the region's economy as the access to forced labor was no longer an option. This change led to the use of sharecropping and tenant farming, which would leave many African Americans jobless in the South. The global influence of the movement was seen as other nations such as Britain, France, and Brazil would abolish slavery in their countries following America's emancipation. Although the emancipation of slavery was a major breakthrough in America, racial tensions did continue to settle in as hardships such as segregation and the Ku Klux Klan continued to hurt all African American citizens.